What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 431. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, what's up, buddy? How goes?
Things are going well. I have made the grievous error of buying a beta JMD tomb for old school. So that kind of means I had also to buy a beta disrupting scepter, and it just goes from there.
Oh no. We never should have done that alpha show. It's just all been downhill from there for you. All right. Well, this week on the show, we've got our Q&A episode. We like to do this once per set to give our patrons a chance to throw questions at us, and they never disappoint, always throw us some really interesting stuff that maybe Luis and I wouldn't have come up with on our own. And it gives us a wider range of topics to talk about in a shorter period of time. And that's what's going on the show this week. First, of course, got to mention our sponsor, channelfireball.com, the place to go for everything you need magic related on the internet. Boy, it's been around for a while, Luis. I saw that post you put on Facebook.
I just shared on Facebook because it was like, on this day or whatever your memories were. And it was 9 years ago when, as of a couple of days, when Channel Fireball launched. So,
That's crazy. I remember way back when it did. I was just getting back into Magic at the time. So for me, for basically the whole run, it's kind of always been a staple. I've always gone there for the content and to buy cards and stuff like that. It's always been around from my perspective. I'm sure many of our viewers, but you guys got that thing off the ground 9 years ago, just a couple days ago. Great stuff. Nice work, Luis. You did good, buddy. It's
Thanks.
Still there.
Yeah, it's pretty long lived as not even just websites or businesses go, just as things. 10 years is a long time.
Yeah, you guys are coming up on that real quick. Of course, you can get anything you need Magic-related. Rivals Vixlon is on sale there. You can get sealed product. You can get singles, supplies, all of it at channelfireball.com. And, of course, you're going to get the awesome free content right on the front page from some of the best Magic players in the world, all completely free. Please check out channelfireball.com. You can also support the show directly via the Patreon. That's an easy way to give back to the creators that help make your life a little better, brighten your day, maybe make you better at Magic, that kind of thing. Patreon.com/limited resources. Now, normally we would ask a Patreon question of the week in this slot, but we're going to be doing a whole bunch of them for this episode. We're going to skip it for this part and bring all the Patreon, all the questions from the patrons in our main topic, which leads us, of course, Le Crack-a-Pack.
And to be clear, this is Rivals, right?
Yes, this is Rivals.
I mean, there's a lot of sets out right now, so or coming out. Like, I don't know.
Oh, that is true. Yeah, this is not Masters. That's not out yet. Ooh, this one smells nice. Goblin Trailblazer, first one up. One in red for a 2/1 menace.
It's serviceable. This is like a card you take third or fourth and are like, okay, this is the color I'm supposed to be in. Not a card you take first, though.
No, it's below the bar. Moment of Triumph. That's the white instant. Target creature gets +2/+2. You gain 2 life. Fine combat trick, but we're not taking it here. Crashing Tide. Where are you at on this one now? 2 and a blue sorcery. Return target creature to his owner's hand. Draw a card, but if you control a merfolk, it's an instant.
I think this card is fine. I generally play it in my blue decks, but I do not prioritize it. It's not something I take very highly. It's just in a controlling blue deck, which I would say more than half of mine are. It's just a card you can play. It's not a card you're unhappy to play or anything like that, but it's not a card you're like overjoyed about either.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, it does go well in the Merfolk deck, which is kind of leaning you down that route right on the text box there. Knight of the Stampede, 3 and a green for a 2/4. Makes your dinosaurs cost 2 less to cast. Powerful.
It is powerful. It's still not a card that I'm really that interested in taking early. And in fact, it's kind of hard to fit this in your deck always too. So I'm not big on Knight of the Stampede.
I'm not either. I thought I would be. Recover. We talked about this one last week. 2 and a black sorcery. Return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Draw a card. I like this card, but not first picking it. Plummet. No. Buccaneers Bravado. That's the 1 and a red instant. Choose one target creature gets +1/+1 and first strike until end of turn, or target pirate gets +1/+1 and double strike until end of turn. You can get people with this card, but again, none of these are cards I'd be happy first picking.
No. So far we're on what, the Goblin Trailblazer?
Yeah, we are. Oh, we just went up that Bombard. Hello.
Okay. Well, this is a 2 and a red instant, deal 4 to a creature. Certainly a fine card, and definitely something that I would be happy to first pick. Still a slightly below average first pick, but it's one of the top commons, so you really can't complain too much.
Right. Snubhorn Sentries are our last common, and that one certainly, it definitely moved up into the playable camp for me, but nowhere near a Bombard. No. So that means we're just going to have to be taken down by one of these uncommons or rares, or, we actually got a foil as well. All right. Let's test your level of commitment. Merfolk Mistbinder.
I would take Bombard over Mistbinder, pick one, pack one. I think despite the fact that Mistbinder is really powerful, if you're not in Merfolk, it's very clearly not all that exciting. And I don't really want to start with a Merfolk card if I can take something just reasonably powerful outside of that.
All right. Next uncommon is Mausoleum Harpy. That's the 4 and a black 3/3 flyer with Ascend. Whenever another creature you control dies, put a +1/+1 counter on it if you have the City's Blessing.
Yeah, I'm not looking to first pick this card either. So I think
it's a little better than I thought, but it's not nowhere near as good as Bombard. All right, another commitment tester, Raging Regisaur, 2 red-green for a 4/4, and whenever it attacks, you can have it do 1 damage to creature player.
Ooh, I do like Raging Regisaur. I would take Regisaur over Bombard. I think it's enough of an upgrade over Bombard that I would take the red-green card, pick one, especially since this fits into both red-green and white-green, so it's not quite locking you into 2 colors in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Because, normally taking a gold card, part of the drawback, right, is that it's in this 2-color combination. But in this format, that's just not true of a lot of the gold cards, and especially not true of dinosaur ones.
Our rare is Induced Amnesia. Not a great card. It's 2 and a blue for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, target player exiles all cards from his or her hand face down, then draws that many cards, and when it is put in the graveyard from the battlefield, you get to return the exiled cards.
It's basically not a card.
Right, not a card. And then we did have a foil. It's a common. It's Martyr of Dusk.
Okay, well, this is a 2/1 for 2 that dies into a 1 lifelink, and this is not a card that I'm going to be first picking either.
No, but so you ended up on the Raging Regisaur.
I have Raging Regisaur over the
Bombard,
but not by a whole lot. And if you're going to tell me that you're going to take Bombard, I don't think that's a grievous error.
I am going to take Bombard. Yeah,
all right, well, I don't think it's a grievous error. So
put him in the arena.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, the tiebreaker.
Yeah, I forgot that's how it worked.
Right, that's how you play limited. All right, so that's the Crack-a-Pack, and that means we've got questions. And we're going to waste no time getting into these questions because we've got a whole bunch of them. So let's do it, Luis. First one up comes from Joel, who says, I guess we're starting off with the
hard-hitting ones first.
Important stuff. Since LSV recently faced off against his evil twin, the user LSV Sucks on Magic Online, I have to ask, has Marshall ever played against the username Marshall Butcliffe?
Well,
this is one of the downsides, right, Luis, of being, even moderately public figures, is that sometimes you have to face off against somebody who's making fun of you. I think I actually have. I definitely have had people send me screenshots and say, "Is this you?" I can't remember if I've actually faced them or not.
I've interacted with a Twitter user, I think, named Marshall Butcliffe, but I don't. And I think I have actually also played against the actual user online as well.
Great. So yeah, thanks, Joel, for that enticing question. Next is from Patrick. It says, in the most recent 5 years, what has been your favorite limited format, both for sealed and draft?
Past 5 years.
How long ago was Cons?
Cons was
that in that window?
Yeah, you can name Cons. I think Cons might have been my favorite draft format recently as well.
Yeah, I would say Cons. I loved that format. Oh, it was so sweet. There's been some good ones now, though. Because this one's good. We both like Hour of Devastation a lot.
Yeah, I think for sealed, it doesn't change. So I think it's the same is true.
Yeah, agreed. Next one comes from Ricky, who says, I love Rivals of Ixalan Draft and have drafted some wacky decks with terrible win-loss records along the way, but had incredible fun. Has there been a format that you've just been terrible at? He says, granted, terrible is a word that has never applied to LSV. What in the world? He said, but thoroughly enjoyed. I don't know. I mean, I've definitely felt there's definitely some formats that click with people better than others. And I felt that, but I don't remember the last one that I just felt like lost. I put so much thought into this stuff. I talk to you, I talk to my friends, we do the podcast. I'm always thinking about this stuff. So it's hard for me to be just horrendous at a format, but I've definitely had ones that were much, didn't click with what I wanted to be doing. And I felt like it did get reflected a bit in my, win-loss rate.
Well, I think the best example I can give for a format where I enjoyed but wasn't really drafting it right was actually I think Kaladesh, where we both kind of thought it was like you could do wacky things and slow, but like all the people like playing on the PT were like, no, you're crazy. It's just a super fast format. So I think
it's all about the the auras, right?
Yeah, and I think we enjoyed all the nonsense and got to enjoy that. Whereas like the people playing it at the PT, because this is when I was doing coverage as well. We're like, we're drafting it, I think, probably a little bit more closely to where it was supposed to be drafted.
Yeah. Maybe we'll stand the test of time there. Only time will tell.
Yeah, there's no real way to know.
Yeah. Next comes from James, who says, I was wanting to start streaming Magic Arena once I can. Do you have any advice for a new streamer, including things like mics and software? Yeah, I do. If you're a new streamer, that's always a tough spot to be in. It helps a lot if you come from something else, like if you have a podcast or a YouTube channel or something along those lines. But if you're brand new to all of it, that's fine too. You can get it going. The advice I would give you content-wise is to kind of figure out who you are. Are you the standard player? Are you the drafter? And try to stick to that for a long time before branching out. I think that people like to know what they're going to see when they show up. They know when they go to Kenji's stream, he's most of the time going to be drafting, that kind of thing. And you can dabble in a little bit extra, but you really want to stay consistent.
It's also,
when it comes to, go ahead.
Especially when you're starting, people don't know you at all. So you do need to spend some time trying to figure out, like, I'm not saying that your net goal has to be to get the most viewers or whatever, but people want, to have people watching them, right? It's a lot more fun to stream for 50 people than it is for 3 people. So a way to kind of help with that and a way to get more people into it is to be pretty strong on like, branding in terms of what you're going to be doing, just so people know what to expect. Just so like they show up at your stream and they're like, oh, this is the guy who drafts or whatever. So. Right.
Yeah, that's a big deal. And then when it comes to mics and software, it's actually pretty straightforward. There's a Logitech webcam that basically everybody uses. I have it in front of me right now. I can't remember the model number on it, but you'll see it. It's about $60 and it's totally fine. It can do 1080 and it's pretty wide angle. So even if you're in a small space, you'll still be in there. It's totally fine. You can get one of those. Almost any USB mic is going to be totally fine. These plug directly into your USB port rather than using an XLR cable, which is kind of what the dedicated audio type mics will use. I highly recommend getting something with a decent mic. It can either be a USB mic that you plug in or a headset that has a mic that goes really close to your mouth, because that's an important piece.
I think that's the biggest thing most people miss is that
it is 100% is.
Yeah. That you do want a mic that is of high enough quality that people can understand you.
It is the most important thing. Like if they can't hear you, people will not stay, period. They will leave. If they can't understand what you're saying, they're gone. So make sure you get that. You don't want to sound like you're in a room. And then for software, most people use one of 2 programs. I use, what is it called? OBS.
OBS. It's what I use as well. It's what most streamers I know use. Because it's pretty user friendly. Like you can look up tutorials, you can look up, some tips and stuff, but it's really not very hard to get connected.
It's also free.
Yes,
so that's open broadcast.
That's an important part of that.
Yeah, you can do really powerful stuff with it if you're willing to put the time in. But if you're just looking to get a stream up, it works well for that too. So good luck with it, James. I know a lot of people are going to be jumping into streaming when Arena comes out. So make sure you're in there early, get this stuff set up now. So that once it goes live, you can be one of the first ones. That helps out a lot too. David asked the next question. Assuming cycling is already evergreen for the sake of the question, what current evergreen mechanic would you replace and with what for a year? Ooh, that's interesting.
I would replace hexproof with anything, including nothing. But
oh, there you go. That's a great answer. I hate hexproof.
But if that's not on the table, I'm not sure. Like, there's nothing I really dislike.
Wait, why is that not on the table?
I don't know if that's exactly what counts here, but if it does, then yeah, hexproof's my answer.
Oh, it counts. Yeah. He wants to know what would you take out and what would you put in place. I would definitely take out hexproof. I hate it.
I like Scry. I think Scry's pretty fun.
Okay, yeah, you like smoothing out.
Explorer is similar, so that's not like that big of a difference. But I do enjoy those kind of effects.
I'm gonna default to the game designer for this one here, and I like that answer a lot. Andy Cohen says, "What would you be doing if you weren't into Magic: The Gathering?" Wow, that's especially for you, Luis, because it's been such a big part of your life for so long.
Yeah, so I learned how to play Magic when I was 11 in 1994. That dates me if you want to do the math. And it has been a huge part of my life, including touching almost every aspect of it. So it's really hard for me to know because the year I started playing Pro Magic was actually the year I graduated from college. I got a degree in political science from UC Davis, and I kept thinking like, okay, I'm going to have to get a real job now. Never did. Like at every point, I have been doing Magic related jobs, and I do have real jobs now. Like this has turned into that, but I never went out and got a non-gaming job. Like I work as a game designer. I have all the things I do for Channel Fireball, play Pro Magic, do commentary, all that stuff. And so the answer of what I do if I weren't doing this, I have no idea. Like not professionally, not really. Like personally, I have maybe slightly different answers because like I do enjoy things that aren't Magic. Like I do enjoy playing board games, and I enjoy playing basketball, and I enjoy cooking, and I enjoy hiking. Those aren't Magic related, but I do those with people who like Magic. So it's not I don't think it's a very easy question for me to answer.
Yeah, it's a hard one for me, because I kind of was the opposite. I didn't play Magic during any of those times. I mean, I played when I was in high school a little bit, but I was just basically messing around with it. I wasn't serious about it in any capacity. I had one friend that played, and that was it. I didn't play in any play groups or any tournaments. So that was just a distraction, basically. And then after that, I mean, I didn't really know what I wanted to do for quite a while. I worked at a grocery store for a while. Then I started working at AT&T, and I was working on their website. That was kind of my first like real job, that actually had potential for me to move up and to make money that, could support an adult. And, but then I ended up not really liking that much and leaving for Magic. Now it's hard for me to imagine because I've been doing it for long enough that it's like, the one thing that I think about, the one thing I think about is that cubicle in my rearview mirror. I really didn't fit into that lifestyle. Like I don't like getting up early. I don't like sitting still. I just, and I kind of have just been scrapping my way away from it ever since. So I don't know. It's a great question, Andy. I think that
I would like to
the
think
next step
that both of us would be able to find something sweet to do if it wasn't Magic, but there's no guarantee of that,
No, there isn't. I'm glad that this is what I ended up doing. But also, I think that the next step for me might be doing similar things to what I do for Magic, just about other subjects, not necessarily games, but like maybe, learning or, whatever, science stuff or something like that.
Science stuff.
I don't know. Like I'm a curious person. Apparently I have no idea what I would be doing
if I were playing Magic, I'd be doing science stuff.
Oh man. Brian asks, when should I prioritize card advantage sources over straight removal?
Generally, straight removal
Very
is better.
rarely.
Yeah. And you can pick up card advantage as needed, but you don't need to prioritize it.
Yeah, the main reason for that is just because removal is the hot commodity. It's the thing that you want usually about as much as you can get in a deck. It's rare that you're going to pass a removal spell for a not removal spell in draft. That comes up almost never. And the reason is that in your average deck, you would love to have, say, 4, 5, 6 pieces of removal if you could get them. And you end up usually with 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, something like that. Where when it comes to card advantage sources, as you put it, Brian, you probably want 0, 1, or 2 of those in an average deck. And so on average, you want way fewer. So straight removal is going to be prioritized basically every time.
I think a good way to think about that is like, when you would break this would be like uncommon card draw, like Tidings or something, like 5 mana draw 4, like the really powerful card draw spells. Those you'll probably take over some of the common removal spells, but for the most part, that's just not going to happen.
Right. Brandon asks, I don't get the opportunity to draft much, but I've been playing a ton of Magic Arena right now. Since that format is basically Ixalan block constructed, have you considered doing an episode on that? It definitely feels like a strange format, so your guys' perspective could be very helpful. No, that doesn't really fall under the purview of limited, and we like to try to stick to limited topics for this podcast. That's more of a pseudo constructed for people that aren't on the arena beta. Basically, they give you a bunch of packs, 30 something packs. You just open them all up and you build the best deck that you can from those. It's, I guess you could call it like super duper duper sealed, but but Brandon's correct that it actually plays a little bit more like Ixalan block constructed than anything else. So no, when it comes to arena though, I have been trying to think about how best to capture any potential new players. We want to make sure that they know that we're here as a resource, because I'm assuming a lot of people are going to pick it up when it finally goes live and say, what is this booster draft thing? I want to get better at this, or I want to figure out what it's about. And I'm hoping that they'll end up coming to us, right? Because that's what that's the whole point of this entire show. And I am trying to figure out any maybe ways that we can sort of set ourselves up to be visible to those people. Yeah, maybe we'll do an episode about arena or something, but we're not going to be talking about the metagame on the beta. It's also just a very few people that are actually able to play it, Brandon. Next one comes from Matt Snow White, who says, hey, Marshall and LSV, I was wondering which cube you think A, is more skill testing, and B, better for one's development as a player, Vintage Cube or Legacy Cube?
Ooh,
great question, Matt.
I think in terms of player development, I wouldn't really worry a ton. Like, they're both just going to be sweet, and they're going to teach you how to like play novel situations. I think in terms of skill testing, I think Legacy is more skill testing, because Vintage, I think, is harder to draft good Vintage cube decks, because it matters so much more trying to figure out the cards that are relevant and then the ways to combat all these fast starts. But the gameplay, I think, with Legacy Cube is just a little bit easier to manage. So
yeah, I agree. I think that the more skill testing, well, I should put it this way. The one that's better for one's development, I think, is the Vintage Cube. For the reason, excuse me, the Legacy Cube, not the Vintage Cube, the Legacy Cube.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and the reason I say that is because it does resemble most other limited formats more. It's just like super powered versions of that, and there's some cool decks. Where Vintage Cube is kind of this unique experience. There's no other cube or even Magic experience like Vintage Cube. So to me, it's very, very specialized. The thing I do like about Vintage Cube, though, for developing as a player, is that it does teach you the outer limits. It teaches you to completely scrap any idea of the box that you had. And, when the first time you watch somebody draft a Storm deck, you're like, oh my God, like I just had no idea that this was even possible in any limited environment for people to take cards that look this bad or this weird and actually piece together wins. Although I am skeptical that you can piece together wins in the Vintage Cube and Storm. But anyway, I just think that Legacy Cube at least has some roots still in like a regular booster draft, and you're going to see similarities. Like removal spells are there. They're just super, super good. They're sweepers, way more of them than you'd see, that kind of thing. But the similarities are closer. Thanks for the question, Matt, and we'll see you next time you're in Seattle. Jeff says, for each of you, what's your favorite archetype and why? Is it a usual archetype in many sets, or is it something that you see rarely? If you could pick cards and rarities to put that archetype into an upcoming master set, how would you seed it? Well, that's a bigger question, that last one. But what is your favorite archetype and why, Luis?
So I think that on a individual level, I really like drafting to like Dampen Thoughts, Splice into Arcane Deck, and Champions of Kamigawa, but that's like completely one-off, never going to happen again. It's just a thing I enjoyed. In terms of like a more macro level of things that get repeated, I like blue-red spells. I always find those decks really fun to play. And that has popped up in a couple different spots.
Remember when you played it at GP San Jose?
Yes, that deck was so sweet. There's a little bit of footage
of it. That was unbelievable. There is. I have had a chance to look at it. I was prepping for a potential rewind, and I got to watch you. I think you were playing against Dave Williams. Is that correct?
Yeah.
You were like super far behind, and we cut camera to some other match, and then we came back and you just won.
I had just like, what the hell? This deck that had like 2 of the 4/2 hexproof prowess, whatever, I don't even remember the name anymore, for 4 and a blue. And
I remember that card.
Yeah, it's like Whirler Adept or something like that. And then it had the 3/2 prowess that you can pay blue, or you can pay red to give double, or blue to give double strike. And flying, whatever that legend was, like Shun Yu or something. And I had 2 copies of like Temur Battle Rage and a bunch of like tap your whole team or 3 creatures can't block like nonsense. And
just cheesing them out.
I just thought I was winning all the games, but but because it was a team tournament, you would look over, right, match by match, just to try to see what was going on. And it looked like I was losing all the games because Dave would also have a bunch of creatures out, not have like one thing in play, but I was always just about to 20 him. So like, yeah. I won that match pretty easily, and it was really sweet.
It was very fast.
It quite a bit.
Whirlwind Adept was the Whirlwind Adept.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, I didn't
4 and a blue for a 4/2 hexproof prowess. Not a very good card, but Luis made that thing sing. For me, I like blue-black or blue-green. Whenever I can get it. I remember one of my favorite archetypes was the Evolve deck in, what was it, Gatecrash or whatever that was set was. Yeah, remember the flyer?
Yeah,
the blue Raptor. Zero. What was it? Yeah, Cloudfin Raptor. Yeah, I love that deck. That was definitely one of my favorites. And then I've had a bunch of different blue-black decks that if I can draft those, usually those 2 colors do a lot of the types of things that I want to do in a given format. Next question comes from David. It says, pile shuffle, yes or no?
Nope.
No. Jethro, I love to know any other podcast recommendations, magic or non-magic related.
I'll let you.
Luis, I know you listen to a lot of podcasts, including this one, so I'll let you start.
I'll let you handle this one.
The list is too long for you to remember at the moment. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. I work from home effectively, right? If I'm not traveling for an event, I'm editing videos here, or I'm prepping for the show, or, working on a project or whatever. And that means that I'll have quite a bit of time when I'm out running errands or doing anything to listen to a podcast. And I do. In fact, let me just grab my phone right now. Oops. And we'll see some of the ones that I like to listen to. I listen to a lot of Bill Simmons. He does sports related podcasts and kind of pop culture stuff. I like that a lot. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History is a podcast that our friend from the Command Zone, Josh Lee Kwai, recommended to me. And I almost didn't believe it the first time. He's like, oh, this is sweet. The new episode of Hardcore History came out. I'm like, cool. I'm like, I've never heard of that. It sounds interesting. I like history stuff. So I downloaded it and I hit play. It's 6 hours long. And I'm like, this is one episode. It's 6 hours. Yeah. They basically come out once every 6 months or a year, and they'll put together these huge swaths of covering massive chunks of history. But this guy goes super deep. It's really good if you drive a lot and you're into history. So I like that one. I like Freakonomics Radio. The Low Post, that's another basketball one. I listen to computer ones, one called Mac Break Weekly, which is about Macintosh. For political stuff, I listen to Pod Save America, Pod Save the World as well. NBA stuff, stay tuned with the tech guy. Yeah, the kind of, it covers a swath of the stuff that I like. And then I do listen to some magic podcasts as well. I listen to Tap Tap Concede from Loading Ready Run, as well as North 100, which is a Canadian Highlander podcast that they put out. I like those ones because I really like them, and it just feels like kind of hanging out with friends when you're up there as well. Sometimes I listen to Brainstorm Brewery, which is Corbin Hostler, my friend and coverage coworker, puts that one out as well, and Magic the Ameturine too. That's Marie and Megan's podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts. So
yeah, that's what I'm starting to get.
You picking up that vibe? Next question comes from MH. Says, I have trouble evaluating my limited decks to know how strong they are, often underestimating strong decks or overestimating weak decks. This makes it hard to know if I'm building the best deck in my pool. How can I improve at being able to accurately tell how good a deck is and whether it is objectively better or worse than another deck? Wow, MH, you went deep. You can't. Right? You can't objectively say that one deck is better than the other unless there's a big gap there, right?
Yeah, it's going to be hard. You can. Like, I bet you could take 10 pros and if you got like 7 of them to think one deck is better, then I would say that that's probably enough circumstantial evidence to agree. The thing
to cross over into objectively.
Yeah. Well, to make it like not objectively, but to make it useful to say that. But the thing is,
sure,
in draft, it doesn't matter. In draft, like you're not like building from a pool as much as like you drafted a deck. There's not that many options. For sealed, it does matter a little bit more to try to figure out which one's better. But in general, I don't think this is like a hugely important skill. So
Yeah, well, like how would you even apply it, right? So let's say that you know that your deck is extremely good. So what? Right? Like if you know that your deck is terrible, so what? Like, what are you going to do about it? Right? You build the best deck that you can. Now, if you're having a hard time comparing two builds to each other, like Luis said, then of course, yes, that does make a little more sense. But yeah, I wouldn't focus on this too much, MH. I think that it's a skill that's difficult to nail down. You'd probably need to do something like Luis said. And even if you do get to that answer, you have to really think about like what you're going to use that for. And if that's where you want to be putting your mental energy while you're building. Jonah Lipton asks, "Hey, Marshall and Luis, I love the show and I love all the content you guys make. Just today I watched Marshall's video for Canadian Highlander and it got me thinking, where do you guys draw the line for playing cards you like and playing cards that are strong? I think this can be applied to both limited and constructed." Jonah's referencing a video I put up on Channel Fireball yesterday where I decided to play Canadian Highlander on Magic Online just to show it to people and see if they liked it. I might make more of them if people like it. I just kind of wanted it to be an introduction. But one of the things about the Highlander deck that I play is, I talked about this during the video, which is what he's referring to, is that when you're playing a 100-card singleton, you end up going pretty deep down the card list, right? It's like there's only so many, say lightning bolt effects before you start getting into kind of the sketchy ones. And sometimes that leaves a little bit of wiggle room to play some cards that you like, right? Like I play Man War in my deck, and I think it's actually like pretty good, but I admitted on the video, there's got to be something better, right? There's probably a better slot, but I liked the unique effect that Man War can have in different types of matchups. Like you can bounce a reanimated target, or you can use it against an aggro deck to slow them down, etc. But I admitted it's a pet card of mine as well. And I wouldn't play a card that I thought was terrible in that type of scenario, but I will play cards that, I happen to like, or I think that are a little bit undervalued in that way. When it comes to drafting and limited, man, I don't think I really do that very much.
Neither do I.
I have cards that I like, but I just don't force. I just shed those things aside pretty quickly and just play the cards that I think are the best.
Yeah, I think that there are there's some argument to like, oh, I really like this archetype, so I'll draft it a little bit more often, or, I have this tendency that I lean towards. But I think in general, both of us do pretty much nail down, like, this is what is good, so I'm going to do this thing. And
yeah,
I don't think that
we'll complain about it. I mean, don't get me wrong. If there's a sweet card in a pack, but we know that there's another card, we'll whine about it. But I usually
right. I'm going to take Impale over Secrets of the Golden City, no matter how much I like drawing cards. So I think that in general, if you think you're doing this, you should probably not. Like, don't make bad decisions because you like something more, unless your goal is to play that card and enjoy it. I mean, that's fine too. Like you don't, not everything is literally about just win percentage.
Right. And if you're taking on the nuts and bolts spike approach that we advocate for here on the show, then the perfect player would never, there's no such thing as preference for a card. It's just what's the best card and how many of them can I get? Michael asks, what skill sets do you think constructed only players miss out on or have a harder time developing by not playing limited? Great question.
This is something I thought about a lot. And I think that one of the biggest is that with enough reps in constructed, you can understand what's going on in a matchup and you just won't encounter that many novel situations. Because if you play like Teamer Energy against Mono Red, just the combinations of cards when both decks are just playing all these like 9/4-ofs, it's just not that big. So like you when you're like, okay, well I have a Whirler Virtuoso and 3 energy and I have a Servant of the Conduit. My opponent has an On-Crop Crasher and a Beaumont Courier and a Kari Zev. You've played the scenario out enough times. It's just you're not trying to figure out new puzzles. You just know what the answer is a lot of the time. In limited, it's just completely unique and novel almost every single game because you're playing a deck with 23 one-ofs and the order and combination keep being different. So what I think limited does is really test your ability to think on the fly and understand Magic at a fundamental level, which I think is super valuable and makes you much better at constructed because then when you play against the Mardu energy deck that you've never seen before because this is the only person playing it, you then can understand what's going on, I think, in a little better way than someone who's just played Construct and just tested the 5 matchups they expected.
Right. You're just much more flexible mentally. Matthew asks, one of the card types that I don't handle well is wraths. And of course, he means board sweepers. If I've played out my creatures and am winning on board, then the wrath will do more harm to me than my opponent. If I know this card is in my deck, but don't know when I might draw it, how do I play in the meantime? So Matthew's saying, look, I've drafted a wrath. I have it in my deck sometimes. Am I supposed to just dump my hand and give myself the best chance to win on board? Or should I be hedging in case I draw my wrath?
Well,
you should be playing out your cards.
Yeah.
The way I play it is if I don't have the wrath in my hand, I just pretend it doesn't exist.
I think that it really depends on the board state, because there are some where it's just like, well, I could play an extra creature out, but if I don't draw the wrath, I'm still just going to lose. Once you're in that position, then you can't really help it, right? You're not changing the outcome of the game much by trying. You're not really accomplishing much by not playing it out. But I think that in general, you should play around wrath, or play as if wrath was in your hand when you have it, but don't play as if it's the top card of your deck unless you have a specific reason to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually rarely correct to play a creature that doesn't change anything on board conceivably at all, right? Heck, they could have a wrath.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Like, I think if you
just like as a generality.
Right.
Okay, next one comes from Logan, who says, hi, Marshall and Luis. When you guys evaluate X matters cards, like creature type matters for Forerunners or spells matter for cards like Scribe of the Mindful, will you throw out a minimum threshold number of cards to make these cards work. For example, this is playable with 4 vampires, but needs 6 or 7 to be great, or this really needs 9 or 10 spells to work well in your deck. Other than looking at the floor of a card in general, how do you determine the minimum number of cards needed to make these work? Because we do, right? We try to give people a ballpark figure so that they understand that, for example, maybe there's a card that you really only need 1 of the other thing, and then you're still fine with it. And there's some that need 10, right? That you just don't play it unless you have all merfolk or whatever. I mean, you're basically just kind of eyeballing these things, right?
Yeah.
You're just estimating.
I mean, what Logan said is actually true, which we do look at the floor of the card. That is like the biggest indicator about whether something is going to be acceptable, because we're just trying to think like, okay, well, what will it take to make this card playable? We're not really looking a whole lot deeper, because it's the sort of thing where if it's playable at 7, it's probably pretty good at 10, and at 15, it's amazing. We're not really. We're trying to basically provide you the minimum viable product, of how many of the specific type you're looking for do you need in order to make this card playable? Because once you know that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter a ton to know whether it's how much better it is at 10 than it is at 8. Like, unless you're like looking at it during a draft, sometimes you're like, at what point does it all of a sudden become better to take a Merfolk Matters card over, just like a high quality card like a Thrashing Brontodon? But in general, I wish we had a more scientific reason here. But honestly, what we have is like most things take about 6 or 7, and if it needs to draw 2 of them, you probably need like 10 or 12. Past that, it's kind of like there's wiggle room.
Yeah, I mean, this is intuition and experience speaking. And, in Magic, since we don't have models or, mathematical models,
we don't.
Frank complex algorithms. He probably does. Yeah. This is how we solve our problems. Next one comes from Jonathan, who says, a Magic player I respect once told me I could improve my drafting by, quote, seeing what's not in the pack, end quote, which at the time sounded like a Zen Cohen kind of a coaching advice Phil Jackson would give if he coached Magic instead of basketball. Is there anything to this advice? If so, could you explain or give examples of, quote, seeing what's not there in Magic? Well, this is really funny, Luis. I think his friend just meant look at the cards that are missing.
Yeah, this was not as mystical as it might sound. It's more like you first picked a red card and then took 3 white cards in a row, and then fifth pack, it's like still no red cards. It's like, red's probably not open. I should probably not draft red.
Yeah, or even one of these things where like somebody passes you, pack 1, pick 2, and you go, oh look, the rare's missing.
Right.
Like meaning that the really great card that let's say somebody passes you just like a bomb uncommon or whatever, and you think, how could this still be in the pack? You look to the person who's passing it to you. They know them, they play Magic. It's not like somebody who's brand new to the game and just doesn't know what they're doing. and you think, wow, the rare's missing. Maybe they opened blankety blank. There's only a few cards you would take over this other card or that kind of thing. Probably just doing a little bit of that basic legwork to kind of maybe give yourself a hint as to the colors that your neighbors might be in.
But
I like Jonathan's approach, though, just to get all zen.
If you want to interpret it, yes, I said in a more zen fashion, that is pretty sweet.
I like it. Joe asks, hey, Marshall and Luis, love you guys and the show. Thanks, Joe. I've noticed that whenever I draft lately on Magic, my opponents have some nasty decks round after round, no matter if I'm 2-0 or going for 3-0 or 0-2 trying to save face. When I draft in person or even in the old draft format before the leagues, if I drafted a solid deck, I knew I could finish at least 2-1. Now it seems like a roll of the dice. Do you guys see any of this? If the situation comes up more than not, is it helping me to prepare for my in-person drafts more? Is this just a byproduct of leagues?
I have not found that to be the case.
I haven't seen it either, but I don't really pay attention to stuff like that.
Yeah, I do not. I feel like it's not statistically significant, but I think that in general, leagues do make people's decks a little bit better because people are less likely to hate draft. But I think that for the most part, this is not something that I have found to be a very noticeable effect.
Yeah. If it is happening, Joe, you asked if it's helping you prepare for your in-person drafts more. Yeah, it is. I mean, if you're facing better draft decks over and over and over again, well, you're learning how to scrap out those wins, and you're figuring out how to maximize your percentages because you don't get that much wiggle room as normal. So, yeah, I don't know, Joe. That's a very difficult thing to track, and I don't know if it's happening or not. It's hard to say. Andy says, when you're traveling with people, do you find it hard to keep the momentum? He says, I find I have trouble trying to balance my family and friends with Magic. So I was wondering if you had some strategies I can employ to help myself just balance it all together. He says, as always, you guys are great. Keep up the amazing work. Thank you, Andy. I think Andy came to probably the wrong people for this advice. You and I just went all in on Magic and made it into a career. Balance, at least for a good 3 to 4 year stretch for me, and perhaps longer, was not the name of the game. In fact, I actually feel like I was quite out of balance with regular life, and I'm still trying to kind of get back to that.
I think doing a good job trying to connect with friends, like one of the things I have found in general is that people just don't do a great job of that. Like, how often do you talk to your friends at home and do something and hang out? Like, not to put you on the spot, but how many times have you had a meal by yourself in the last week where you could have tried to like call someone and just hang out?
Oh, totally. Right? I do it all the time.
And this is, like I said, this isn't like accusatory. I'm just saying, like, it's very easy to.
No, but I am a good example for this because, when I quit my job and I wanted to try to make this whole thing work, I threw myself into it 100%. Now, this wasn't quite the same as being a full-time Magic player. This was more on trying to start something up with the podcast and the other stuff. But I mean, it has a similar effect. I was traveling a lot, so, the same time that Magic players would be traveling, and I was putting in work during the week as a Magic player would on Magic stuff. So I certainly can relate, to what Andy's saying here.
And then another thing that I've found that technology is pretty good. Like, I use like FaceTime more often than I used to just to talk to like my brother in California, who I don't get to see as often as I would like. And I think that sort of stuff is easy to get away from or not realize when you have this opportunity here that a lot of people just used to not have because technology didn't used to work that way. So
right. Yeah, I like that. Those are good tips, and I hope you find a good way to balance it out, Andy. Magic can be a very all-encompassing game, but I think that you're a better player and a better person if you keep it balanced. EJ says, hi, Marshall and Luis. When evaluating cards during spoiler season, I tend to focus heavily on the floor of a card. Most of my peers do the opposite and focus on the ceiling and potential of cards. Sometimes I feel I miss out on some otherwise impressive cards because I focus too much on the bad. Do you have any tips on how to balance your evaluations when considering floors versus ceilings? Thanks, guys. Love the show. Love the question, EJ. This is definitely something that I do as well. And one of the things that I do when it comes to the floors versus ceilings is I tend to be in your camp as well. I tend to think my goal is always to try to find what I believe to be the average case scenario is for a card and think about the times when it would be really good and the times when it might be really bad and how often I expect those times to happen. So I'm trying to be balanced with it, but I'm a skeptic for sure. I'll look at a card and say, I can see that there's something here, but that's a lot. We talk about setup cost on the show. I try to factor that in as well. A card that has a high setup cost is one that needs a lot of things to go right for you in order for it to be really good. And if those things don't go right, it often means that the card's really bad, not just neutral, but actually on the other end of the spectrum. And for me, if I really can't figure out a card, I'll do one of two things. I'll either just try it. I'm much more willing, especially in the early stages of the draft format, to just run a card out there and just see what happens. Or if I really think it's bad, but other people think it's good, I'll wait for it to start beating me. I'll say, look, show me. Like when I start losing to that card, or when people play that card and I go, actually, that is really annoying. Like that card's really pulling its weight here. Then I'll join the team. But if I really feel strongly that a card's not great, I'm not going to be the one to try it out. I'm going to let other people do it. And once I start losing to it, then I'll know, okay, I was wrong. And I'm going to jump ship and start drafting that card more often.
I think that one of the most useful card evaluation tools I've found, and we both employed this, is to just compare it to past cards. Like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And there's a lot of cards already that have existed. And there's probably a lot of cards you played with that you can look at and be like, this looks like a worse version of this card or a better version of this card. And of course, each format's different, and cards that are awesome in some formats are terrible in others. Like, this has happened. But for the most part, it can give you a good starting point. You can adjust up or down from there instead of worrying about trying to, from first principles, derive how good, like a 3/4 flyer for 5 is or whatever.
Yeah, but I actually think you're in the right spot, EJ. I think that you should start off
most people
with a skill.
Are way on the other side of things. Like when we do our set review, or I write a set review, or any of the initial things, the comments are filled with like, well, at the pre-release, this card was great for me, or like, but this card could be a 5 for 1. And it's just like, people just have these like rose-colored glasses when they look at new cards. And I find that to not be super useful.
Right. We called that a best case scenario mentality. And it was one of the first episodes that Ryan and I did when we started the show, because it's that important. Next one comes from David. He says, hi, Marshall and Luis. Thanks for the podcast. It's really helped expand my previously limited skill set. My question is about metagaming in limited. You spent episode 426 talking about Luis's preparation for the PT. And part of that was not only focused on developing pick orders, but also understanding how other people value cards relative to you. I was wondering how you figured out the draft metagame. For constructed formats, you can look at the deck list aggregator and figure out what decks are the most common, but you don't necessarily get an average pick number for cards. Is there a systematic way of doing this, or is it simply just an intuition for what cards can wheel? Thanks for the show and keep up the good work. What do you think, Luis?
I think that it's mostly intuition, but it's not just exactly intuition, but it's more like experience. Especially when we're testing for the PT, we have access to like 10 different, teammates and what has happened in their drafts. And there is when we get to look at a bunch of like, hey, no one's taking Sailor of Me. We keep getting them, 6th to 10th pick. And if that holds up, especially when someone has called it out, other people look for it a little bit more. And if that holds up, then yeah, we have something there. We're not really we don't have access to deck lists or whatever, because this isn't constructed. So it's hard to figure that out in any really meaningful way.
Yeah, one other thing that you have to realize about Luis and I is that we live in a little bit of a different world when it comes to Magic, because we're both pretty ingrained in the professional Magic scene, and people talk and there's opinions expressed on social media or Facebook or within the teams or whatever. And you do start to develop kind of a bigger picture on what people like out of a format. And that's another data point that eventually comes out to everybody, but in the pre-Pro Tour stage is often hidden. William has our next question. He says, Loading Ready Run has their You're Brainstorming Wrong shirt, which raises the question, how do you brainstorm to its fullest potential? You've been playing a lot of Legacy lately, Luis. I'm sure you've been casting a lot of brainstorms.
No, I have cast actually none. But
I know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do it on your main phase. Have a fetch land. I don't know.
No, that is really it. Like, if I were to give people one tip to cast Brainstorm better, it's to wait longer. You should almost never brainstorm on turn 1. Brainstorm on turn 2 can be okay, but the longer you wait, the more value you get, the more you know about what you're missing, what you need, what is good against your opponent, what isn't, and it gives you more options. And brainstorm is kind of all about options. So I think that, like you said, just waiting and casting it as when you have a shuffle effect is the name of the game.
Chris says, hey guys, the last 2 blocks have had moderate to bad draft experiences when only the large set was drafted. Yet when the small set showed up, they turned around into some of the best. Are you at all worried about losing that small set come Dominaria? We're hoping that WotC does a shift in the large sets towards a better draft experience than the previous ones. That's a great question, Chris, because I have thought a bit about this. I've played plenty of excellent single set, big set, triple drafts formats, right? That have been really fun and really good. And in fact, most of the time when the small set comes in, I like it actually less. I'm usually like, it's only been these last few that I haven't really enjoyed the triple big set as much as normal, that the saviors kind of came along with the Hour of Devastation and then Rivals of Ixalan really turning the formats on its head. So yeah, I think the second question he had is kind of the thing. I'm just hoping that they nail a little bit harder in the triple big set drafts.
I think, it's mostly just chance. Like in general, I think that triple big set is more fun. So Chris isn't wrong. The last 2 sets were much better once the small set got added. But that isn't what I would assume is going to be like the normal case.
Right. Also, it's worth noting here that no matter what, another set's coming along in 3 months to change everything up. In this case, it just wipes out whatever the set was. So if you do find yourself with one that you don't like that much, you got another one coming on the horizon still. Creator says, hey guys, as usual, love the show. Thanks for everything. He says, it took me from being the store buy who hated drafting to a guy who runs the local tables and had enough courage to stream my drafts. Wow, that is really cool. He's looks like you can find him at twitch.tv/mpnumbers. I've never actually watched your stream before, but still, that's really cool that you're doing it. My question, is it possible to just not have a good seat at a draft? There's been times where I'll be deep in one color or archetype and realize I've been pulled too far and it's not actually open and my pile isn't that good. But then when I watch the back draft, it feels like there weren't really any other colors open for me to have gone in either. Is it bad packs? Is this bad packs? Is it affected by early picks, or am I just complaining and looking for excuses? Thanks, Sean. Great question, Sean.
Yeah, and I think that
you can have a bad seat for sure.
Yeah, the answer is sometimes you're just not in a good spot for the draft, and your draft is going to go poorly. It's sad but true, So
it happens relatively rarely, though, right? I mean, that's not the norm.
Well, you won't always get a good deck, and
no, but I find the ones where you look back and go, there was nothing I could have done. That doesn't happen that often. No. I think you can usually maximize and come away with something, even if it wasn't going to be an A+ style.
Yeah, I think generally you can be in a spot where you found something that you could have done better. And it doesn't mean you're going to have a good deck, but you'll at least go afterwards, look and be like, oh, I should have done this. Sometimes you're going to look at a deck and just be like, or a draft and be like, I don't know how I could have salvaged this. And the answer is, yeah, like you couldn't have. It was going to be a mess no matter what. Like the packs were open to such that there's no color that was like fully open. And yeah, that can't happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the main thing for our listeners to focus on is what is it that you could have changed? You're still trying to maximize. It's not, you don't judge yourself on your drafting ability, whether your deck is an A or B or a C. That's not how that works, because you did need your table to cooperate a little bit in order to get up into that upper echelon of the A decks. You needed to open up a bomb rare and it needed to be in your colors that you ended up in, that kind of thing. Where what you should be focusing on is, what could I have done? Now, it is really important skill. It is a really important skill to be able to look back and say, there was nothing. You're not using it as an excuse. You're not throwing your hands up in the air and saying there was nothing. You're saying, I have learned what I can learn from this experience, and now I'm going to go on to the next draft. So you should have that in your arsenal, but don't think that it happens every time.
For sure.
Evan says, hey, Marshall and Luis, since this set has both Traveler's Amulet and Evolving Wilds, I'm wondering, how do we evaluate the optimal number of them? Is one better than the other, and in what instances?
Yeah, Evolving Wilds is much, much better than Traveler's Amulet. And there's no real instance where I can think of what Traveler's Amulet specifically better, is there?
Yeah, we don't have any Revolt here, no.
So basically,
I guess does it add to your... what's it called? Count? Kind of. I don't know. It's still just a permanent
Yeah,
No.
I guess sure. If you're trying to hit the city's blessing, you can play Traveler's Amulet out, but that's pretty thin. So no, in general, just be on the lookout for Evolving Wilds and only begrudgingly play Traveler's Amulet.
Yeah. Matthew says, "Hey, Marshall and Luis, where is your favorite place to play Magic? Do you have a favorite venue to do coverage or just sit down and play? Or do you like to recharge in the comfort of your own home, either using Magic Online or a game night with your friends? What types of qualities in your environment make the game more enjoyable?" It's a cool question.
I mean, in terms of where do I play Magic the most, it's Magic Online, and I think that the convenience of it is very hard to beat. But in terms of like what is my favorite place to play Magic, I think like my favorite venue overall is Hawaii. I think that convention center and what's around it is the most fun. But but I think like in general, I prefer Magic Online, and just in terms of the fact that like I get to play Magic and then go get a snack, or then pick up a match, and then if something comes up, get to go do whatever, as opposed to like devoting a whole night to go draft somewhere. That is a pretty big difference. There's something to be said for creature comforts. But honestly, my favorite...
Also getting to draft more, right?
Yes. My favorite place to play Magic... My favorite time to play Magic and place to play Magic is right before we crack open our first pack at the PT. That's getting...
Ooh, that's a good answer.
Not a fixed physical place, but yes, that is my favorite. That is what I want to do more than anything else.
Yeah, I can tell you that, I've covered many round one drafts at the Pro Tour, and it is electric in that room, especially on the Friday of the Pro Tour. It is really one of the best kind of vibes you'll get into a room. All that hard work has been put into prep, and now people are sitting there anxiously waiting to crack those packs. I do love that as well. Hawaii is a good answer. That is a nice place to be. I play on Magic Online almost exclusively when I'm at home, and I tend to prefer it over almost any other option because I can just do more of it, and I like that. Live drafts are fun, but they're super clunky. It takes 3.5 hours to get one of them done, and I don't love that.
3 times online. Well, right. 4 or 5 if you're really efficient. Yeah.
Kyle says, "Hey guys, do you think having very cheap and powerful removal at common improves or hurts the limited environment?" Of course, Kyle's referring to kind of a design shift that happened about 4 or 5 years ago now, where the removal actually used to be very cheap at common and often instant speed with not that many restrictions on it. Doomblade is the kind of the poster child for this type of card. But as anybody who's drafted in the past, like I said, 4 or 5 years, or maybe even another year on top of that, knows that is not the type of removal that you get these days. It usually costs 4 or 5 mana now, and it's often at sorcery speed if you want to get anywhere near unconditional. What do you think? Do you think that's had a positive effect on Limited?
I think it's complicated. The short answer is no. I actually would prefer the removal to be a little more efficient than it has been. I actually think this format in particular, that's one of the things I like. But I think there's something to be said for having the threats being better than removal, and that's fine. But one of the things that I think is tangential to, or at least on the same like axis as this, which impacts it, is I've been seeing a lot of instances where blocking is not good, or just like the set's themes don't promote blocking. And that worries me. And that's what makes it the lack of removal sting more. If your 3-drop could reliably block their 2-drop, then I would be a lot less unhappy with the current state of removal, as it were. But given that that's not the case, it is, I think, a little bit more frustrating.
Yeah, I'm of the mindset that if you're going to make the removal more expensive, fine. It changes the way that the draft goes. It makes for more interesting draft picks because you actually are looking at closer choices. If you opened a Doomblade at common, it was just better than everything else in the set outside of a few bombs, and that's not really particularly interesting. Where here, yeah, you're looking at some of the more, you're looking at cards like Contract Killing, and you have to put them up against some of the more efficient creatures and really make a decision about it. Generally speaking, removal still wins the day, but there's more exceptions to that than before, where it wasn't even remotely close. The things that I like when they do is when they put a more unconditional removal. Was it Battle for Zendikar that had 3 and a black, exile something, and then also 2 white?
It was Oath of the Gatewatch, Oblivion Strike. is what you're thinking of.
Yeah, Oblivion Strike, and then there was the 2 white, kind of super pacifism in that set as well. And I loved those type of cards because those dealt with all the bombs too. And so as long as I felt that it was always balanced and it made to much better gameplay if you could have big bombs, but you knew that there were unconditional answers for it in the format. So you really needed to wait or try to make sure that you could play it at the right time. And if you were somebody who was playing a control deck, you knew that you didn't just auto lose to the first bomb that they played, even if you did bother to draft removal. So I hope that that's sort of where they skew it towards. I like to see the removal be a little better, even if it is more expensive. Rob says, hey guys, I love the show. I find that when I draft, I often start off 2-0 or 4-0 and sealed, but when I reach round 3, I end up losing. But the reasons seem to vary. Sometimes I keep hands that seem keepable but do poorly. Sometimes I have to mulligan a bunch, and sometimes I just get top decked or outplayed. I can count the number of times I've won a limited event on one hand. Am I just unlucky, or am I getting too excited from doing well and making poor decisions? Or maybe I'm just not quite there yet to be a 3-0 player.
I think that there's something to feeling pressure or, maybe getting too excited or what have you in situations like this, because that is a real effect that can happen. But there's no such thing as a 3-0 player if you go 2-1 a lot. Like there's no real difference there. Sometimes you'll win that last game and sometimes you won't, but you're not like doing a particular thing super wrong. So I wouldn't worry a ton about that. And I think if you consistently find yourself in the finals, then you're probably doing something pretty right.
Yeah, I also like, Rob, that you're aware of this stuff. I think that being aware of it means that you can know when you're overthinking things or when you're paying too much attention to things like that. Just focus on each decision. If you have to mulligan, don't go, oh no, here it comes again. Just say, I'm going to take a mulligan. Shuffle up your cards, draw your next cards, and evaluate your next hand. Don't get into that spiral where you start to kind of predicting these things ahead of you. It's much better to just focus on each decision. And then the next thing you know, you'll be like, oh, I won. Cool. And you'll just move on to the next draft and hopefully keep that winning streak going. Next one is from Ira, who says, one of my favorite podcasts in recent memory was the Alpha Deep Dive you did with Ben Sek. I also really enjoy the Rewind series on MTG Breakdown. Have you ever considered doing a dedicated MTG history podcast? Maybe Ben Sek and Ben Starr could team up for a nostalgia podcast and call it, oh, come on, Ira. Been there, done that. That's an interesting question. I mean, we were always tossing around ideas for different podcasts or projects or thing like that. Yeah, I mean, history of Magic stuff is something that I'm interested in because there was a lot of it that I didn't live through. I've got some hands-on experience, like I mentioned, from when I was in high school, which is how I, was relating to a lot of the alpha stuff that we talked about on that show. But there's a big gap after that where I didn't play until Shadowmoor. It was 10 years plus that I just have no real visibility on. And that stuff, I always find it interesting. So yeah, maybe, I don't know. It's a possibility.
I think,
right.
Yeah. And I think that you could, where we would put this stuff is always up for debate, but I think that there's a lot of room for us to talk about stuff that's involving Magic that is not just limited or not just constructed or whatever it is. Like whether Ben Sek and Ben,
it won't happen here on LR, but
Ben Sek and Ben Stark are not doing a podcast though. I can tell you that much. So
no, we're not listening to it if they do. How about that? Daniel says, hey guys, I don't have a question. I just wanted to give you a big thanks and a funny story. I've drafted Triple Ixalan precisely one time. At the time, my only knowledge of the set had come from the LR podcast and listening to you hate on it worse than Amonkhet's. It just so happens that one draft was for a PPTQ and I won it all. Nice. It was only a 30-person PTQ, but it was the first notch in my potential Pro Tour belt, and I felt you two helped me a great deal. Thanks again. Awesome, Daniel. Great work. 1 for 1. He played perfectly.
Yeah,
he drafted the format we didn't like that much, and he only had to do it once.
Sounds like a good plan to me.
Yeah, we'll see you at the PT, Daniel. Hopefully you can take down that RPTQ. Shane says, in my local game store, we have a lot of inexperienced players. Many of them are scared of drafting as they don't know what they should do in terms of card picks and they find it intimidating. What advice would you offer players like this who are sitting down to draft for the first time? Crash course in drafting. I mean, I tell players that it depends on how inexperienced they are, but assuming that they understand the basic mechanics that you're going to be passing cards and that you're going to build a deck from that pool. I mean, remember, new players often think that they have to draft lands. Right. They're like, well, I had to take this land because I was worried I wasn't getting it enough. And you go, oh, I probably should have told you that you can use as many lands as you want. But assuming that they know that stuff, I tell them you're going to be playing 23 of these spells. You're going to try to stick to 2 colors as hard as you can. At the beginning, just take the cards that you like, the cards that looks exciting or powerful to you. And then once you kind of get it narrowed down to 2 cards, you basically just ignore the rest of the cards in the pack outside of those 2 cards, which means you're breaking down your decision from 11 cards down to 3 or 4 or 2 or 3. And then you pick the one that you want to play the most. And then when it comes to the deck building, I'll usually try to show them about a mana curve and stuff. But I find that overwhelming somebody too quickly is what gets them to that point of being intimidated. And I try to tell them to just, it's okay. Like, just pick 2 colors, pick the cards that you think look exciting. It's not, there's no perfection when it comes to drafting. And I think people tend to pick up pretty quickly. I think that people tend to pick up pretty quickly that it's not quite as intimidating as they normally think. Really cool though, Shane, by the way, for you to ask that question, because I think that is a really big part of the equation, is having experienced players to help out in a reasonable way. You have to be careful, right? Nobody likes the person who's at the store who's overreaching in that way, right? Who's trying to say, oh no, you shouldn't be playing this card, and coming off as that kind of condescending person or a know-it-all. But when you do see somebody who might need help, if you can say, I'd be happy to help you out if you ever want a hand. And if they say, oh, thank God, what do I do? I'm totally lost. Then go ahead and help them out. Do it in a tactful way. And I think that people like that in the stores are super, super, super important, because drafting is hard to get into. I mean, that's the hardest thing, is getting people into it. Once they do, forget it. They'll never look back. But that first draft can be rough. Next comes from Ben. He says, hey guys, my friends and I decided we're in for the Team Limited GP in Washington, D.C., and I'm really stoked. Awesome, Ben. That is great. He says, we played 2 years ago and had a grand time, even placed in the money. Can you speak to what the greatest tournament format is and why it's team sealed? He says, on a related note, do you think that the switch to a single set format with Dominaria will affect team sealed at all?
I do think team sealed is the greatest tournament format. It's the one that I personally have the most fun playing.
He nailed it.
Yeah, there we go. And will it affect Team Sealed to have it a new format? No, it's not going to be that different than any other Team Sealed you ever played. Like, learn the cards, learn which decks are good. Well, I mean, what the themes are could change things. Like Tribal, I thought made a somewhat uninterested build compared to not Tribal. So, but I think in general, you should be able to figure it out.
Good luck at the tournament to you and your team, Ben. We'll see you there. Swordsman says, what are the signs that help you know how to change gears between sets? Beyond the natural synergy of the cards, how quickly do you look for a fast or slow set, or when a certain removal is just too expensive for a format? I'm having issues adjusting to from Ixalan to Rivals, and expect that shifting gears between big sets in the future will be a similar adjustment.
Yeah, we have trouble too. We look at our like evaluation, right? We underrated all the slow cards and overrated all the fast cards coming into the set, because it is hard to figure out what is right and where you're supposed to be at.
It will be easier, by the way. He asked if it's going to be easier, but when it's all big sets, and I think it will be, because one of the reasons that you and I had that in our head wasn't just because we had that sort of carryover cook time from Ixalan of it being a fast format, but also because 1/3 of the draft packs are made up of packs that are of that faster format, which is, that's a significant amount of cards. That won't be the case anymore when it's just big set single.
Yeah, I think that's true. And we're not going to get tricked as often, because we evaluated Rivals and Amonkhet, or the addition of Rivals and Hour of Devastation in relation to Amonkhet and Ixalan that were really fast and then became less fast. Here, if it's never the old set plus the new set, we're not going to run into the problem where we think it's going to be fast because the old set was fast. Here, we know it's just starting from new every time. And that should help, because whatever happened in the previous format doesn't change what happens in the new one, right? Like, just because the last format was fast, if it's all new cards, that doesn't mean it carries over in any meaningful way.
By the way, our next question is about that. He says, hey guys, this is Matthew. He says, hey guys, thought experiment. We just come off 2 blocks where fast formats have been followed by slower formats that initially appeared to be fast before proving otherwise. But how many cards were these formats away from actually being aggressive? Say you wanted to make Rivals a distinctly fast format. What cards from Ixalan would you substitute in to accomplish that, and what would they be replacing? Is this a matter of a handful of commons or one of much broader structural features? I think it is actually just a matter of a handful of commons, to be honest. It doesn't take much. You take away a couple of the more defensive commons and you turn those into evasive threats, and all of a sudden the format's super fast. I mean, this format does have a few pretty quick decks in it as it stands. You can draft those.
Yeah, it doesn't take much. Like, you replace a sun-crested Pterodon with a territorial hammer skull, and all of a sudden white got way more aggressive. Yeah. And it just does not take very many swaps like that before you end up in a spot where beatdowns are actually occurring.
Yeah, that's a good question, Matthew. Thank you. Steven says, for someone who is relatively new to Magic, what's the best format to improve my overall Magic skills? Ben Stark recently noted during the Modern Super League that he was playing 80% at limited, 15%, he was playing 80% limited, 15% standard, and 5% modern, while limited and the deck building makes the most fun to me. It is definitely and is definitely great at skill developing. I feel there's a lot more to learn about Magic rules when playing modern. Many thanks. What is the best format? It has to be limited, right?
If you want to get better at Magic, just play limited. I think I'm not even saying that because this is a podcast about limited or any nonsense like that. I actually do think that limited, for the reason that I kind of went into in that earlier question, tests you the most and gives you the most potential to learn when it comes to just base level like skill at Magic. And I would encourage people who want to get better at Magic fundamentally to play limited, because I find that the great limited players I've ever known tend to do fine in constructed, and going that direction is not that hard. Just take some time to familiarize yourself with the decks. All the fundamentals. The people I know who are really good at constructed and historically not great at limited have a much harder time going the other direction. And I was one of those people. And you can make jokes if you want, but I think I am actually decent at limited now.
Even Ben, I think even Ben would admit that. Yeah.
But in my experience, the people who are constructed specialists tend to flounder in limited, whereas the people who are limited specialists weren't maybe as good as the constructed people at constructed, but they sure had a lot less trouble with it than going the other direction. Because fundamentally, if you're good at limited, you're good at limited. And you're good at Magic. And if constructed, it doesn't transfer quite in the same way.
Right. Of course, if you're really aiming to be good at modern, you are going to have to play a lot of modern. Like, being good at limited is not going to get you there. It's just if you had to pick one format, it would be limited. Nick says, level up question here. I feel like one of my biggest weaknesses is that I often am too afraid of certain board state and will 2-for-1 myself and attempt to remove my opponent's biggest threat, like a chump block plus a removal spell or something like that. While this might make the board state more manageable immediately, it often puts me behind later in the game. How can I better manage my threat assessment in limited games so that I'm using my cards in a more value-oriented way? One of the ways I look at these type of scenarios is I look at a threat that my opponent has, and I think of a few things. The first thing I think of is, how big of a threat is this? For example, if they play a 1/1 unblockable on turn 1, I think that's not that big of a deal. I'm probably not going to lose to that card under most circumstances. But if they play something huge, like, for example, a charging monster or 5/5 trample, and it had haste, so it already hit me once in many scenarios, I think, okay, I could lose to that imminently. Like, that thing's going to kill me if I don't do anything. And then I think about, well, what are my different options? Because a lot of times you'll have a removal spell in your hand, but those are valuable. You got that one impale, and if you use it on something small, you may lose to the bigger creature later or the bigger threat later. And so the next step is I'll try to figure out if my creatures can do a good job of acting as removal, meaning, can I block with them? Do I have one creature that can block that and does fine? Do I have a 5/5 that I can just potentially trade off for the monster sword? Or do I have multiple creatures? Do I have a 3/3 and a 2/3 that I can put in front and think, they don't have a trick here. I could be in pretty good shape. I could just trade off my 3/3 and I'm fine. And I get to hold Impale in my hand. And then what I'll start to do is, now that I've kind of got the stage set, I'll start to say, well, what's the realistic scenarios here that's going to happen? Like, for example, if I go for the double block, and my opponent does have the trick, am I dead? Because if I'm dead, then I may just have to go ahead and use the Impale right now. But if I'm at a really high life total and I say, I can, if my opponent uses that trick, I can actually take that hit. That's okay. I'll lose my creatures, but I'll trade my creature for a combat trick and I'll lose some value. And then, I'll have to use my Impale at that point. But until then, I'm really really trying to lean on my creatures as virtual removal by basically being threatening blockers to hold back my opponent's threats, and then use my removal spells on the things that are left over. And you have to be able to think 2 to 3 turns ahead in that scenario. And Nick, that's probably what you're not doing. You're probably looking at it like, oh, there's something scary. I need to deal with it now. And the question is, do you really? Because sometimes you can take a few hits from a really good creature even and still win the game, as long as you have a game plan on how to block it or mitigate it in other ways than just using your removal spell or 2-for-1 yourself to do it.
Well, part of the problem I think that Nick has is asking or not seeing that your creatures can be effective removal spells, even though he's just worried that getting into that position is intimidating. And so, yes, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, Marshall, and I think reinforcing that is good. But yeah, it can be scary to try to get to a spot where you're like, oh, I know my creatures are removal spells. There are ways to stop threats, but it's really hard to be able to rely on that and be confident in the board states where that is true. So how do you make that more true? I don't know. It's difficult to get into the right mindset there.
Yeah. William says, have you played MTG Arena at all? And if so, what are your thoughts and impressions? Do you think that it has the potential to replace Moto as the primary place to play digital sanctioned events a few years down the line? I have played it. Looks promising to me, but still in beta. So they've got a bit of a ways to go there. Does it have the potential to replace Moto? Yes. But at least from what I've heard from their streams and stuff like that, is that it's going to have the more current sets and not necessarily the old ones. And if that's the case, then that really isn't a replacement for Magic Online, because Cube Draft, because Playing Modern, all these other things. So my best guess is that you'll see both still. I don't know. I mean, I don't have any inside information on any of this stuff, but I'm just giving you my best guess, which I think is that you'll probably see both products still available. Next question is from Brian. He says, I feel like I've regressed with Ixalan and Rivals. Sorry, Brian. My win rate has taken a hit, and I don't feel like I have the same grasp on the format that I did the last few sets. I'm wondering how much of that is format related versus how my own play may be at fault. Is there any way to figure that out?
Well,
Brian's down in the dumps.
Yeah, and that can certainly happen. If the formats have a lot of similarities, then you can look at something and be like, well, fast formats are problematic, and that could be tough. But as to what's causing this particular thing, I don't know. If you think you're making the good decisions, then it's really hard for us to want to say your play is really not getting you there. Whereas I think in general, if you are able to spot errors, you can fix them. And if you're not able to spot errors, then you're in trouble, because everyone makes errors. So
definitely. Yeah. I wonder if you're doing the work, Brian. The one way to figure out, it's really hard to figure out if you have a grasp on the format, because what does that even mean, right? It's just a difficult thing to understand. But you absolutely can look back at your games or analyze situations in games. Just take a quick snapshot with your phone if it's in a casual setting, or if you're on Magic Online, record your games or go back and watch the replays and actually put the work in and say, I am making a lot of in-game mistakes. Like, I did not play around that card at all, even though it was pretty obvious that my opponent had it or could have it. Or I'm just playing way too quickly and just running into issues with that. Sometimes you just have to put in that work, and that'll at least help, eliminate part of that question. Andrew says, any advice for those of us who play Magic as a secondary hobby? I try to bring up the spike mentality. I bring a spike to mentality to everything competitive that I do, but I know some lessons and experiences are unique to Magic. Any advice for getting the most value out of my play when I maybe log on to Magic Online twice a month or play and play one F&M per month? Love the show. Keep being awesome. And thanks for letting me bug you guys a couple of years ago at PT Milwaukee for some autographs. You bet, Andrew. This is pretty far away from us, right? I mean, I play a lot.
Oh yeah.
I still play. I mean, I play almost basically every day. As a secondary hobby, what would you tell Andrew to try to keep? I mean, I like the idea of listening to podcasts like this, right? Because this is something that you can do while you're not playing, to keep up on stuff at least.
I think there's that. I actually think one big stumbling block here, one thing that I've had to come to grips with sometimes too, is You want to approach things from a spike mentality and be the best you can. But I think learning that you're not always going to be the best at something is also part of it, because I know, like, we're both very competitive, and I've had spots where I just have to be okay with not being the best at whatever the thing is I'm doing, even though that is what my natural drive tells me to do. So, Andrew, like, you're clearly serious about Magic. You listen to this podcast, you play some Magic Online, you play FNMs, that you're talking about the spike mentality. Part of that is letting go and realizing that, like, look, you're not going to be the best Magic player you can be playing this rate. And you know that, right? This is a secondary hobby. Hobbies are fun, and this is your second one. So don't stress too much about it. Use your time efficiently, like Marshall said. Listening to podcasts is good. Trying to play formats trying to repeatedly play the same format is good. Like, whatever it is, format you enjoy, just focusing on that is good. But also just realize, like, you're going to miss some stuff. You're not going to be the sharpest, and that's just part of it. Like, in order to be the sharpest and the best, it takes so much time that, you just be okay with not quite getting there.
Yeah, I would suggest transitioning from spike to nuts and bolts spike. The difference being nuts and bolts spike tend to care more about the decisions that they made, right? We used to say decisions, not results, on the podcast is kind of a mantra. And I think that if you embrace that, you'll be like, look, I'm still improving. I'm still holding my own. But yeah, I mean, you're not going to be the best in the world if you only play a few times a month. Guillaume says, hey guys, love the show. I started my own cube and I love it. I started from the last modern list and slowly adding vintage pieces. I was wondering if any one of you owns a cube, and if so, what does it look like? And if not, what would it look like? Modern, legacy, vintage, powered or not? In a way, my question is also, what is your favorite cube format and why? Any pet archetypes? What are you looking for in a cube experience?
I used to own a cube. I haven't for quite some time now, but I owned a cube before it was cool. Like, I actually.
Oh, you're like hipster cube guy?
I used to have a cube back in like 2004, 2005. And
holy smokes.
Yeah, that was a long time ago.
Wow.
So it's the sort of thing where, even though I haven't cubed in a long time, I still like that sort of thing. I love cube. It's my favorite format. And I've played a lot of cube over the course of my life. If I had to build a cube right now, it would be a vintage cube, and it wouldn't be exact Magic Online list, but I think it would be similar. I think they do a pretty good job of that.
Yeah, I've never owned my own cube, but that's only because I've had the luxury of having friends and Magic friends around me have owned them. They're very popular in Seattle. I know multiple people that have cubes, including Ryan Spain, the original co-host. He actually maintains a paper version of the vintage cube, awesome. And we busted that out a few weeks ago. It is nice, yeah. So I've been lucky in that way. I'll draft effectively any cube that you throw at me, and I'll enjoy it. Keith says, how much of the enjoyability of Rivals is due to the design of the set being less on rails compared to other modern sets?
I don't know I don't know how much that goes into it. I think that yes, it is somewhat open-ended, but I don't know. I like Rivals because of the sweet cards in it, and even though it still has a tribal component, it's still an experience that's fun, regardless of how on rails it is or how not on rails it is. I don't know that that's exactly how I would determine whether a set is good or not.
Keith, by the way, says Team Rocket OG all the way, and he even put like an ASCII character version of Rocket. Old school listener here.
I don't know what a Rocket is.
Yeah. Rocket is Ryan's dog.
Oh, sweet.
And Rocket would make unscheduled appearances on the podcast occasionally
sure.
back in the day. Also has Annihilator 1. Shannon says, I'm an LGS owner here, and I occasionally build my own cubes from time to time. Master sets have been a great, easy way for me to build a more powerful cube. Can both of you tell me what's your most and least favorite cubes you've played before? What do you, this similar question to before, which ones do you like and hate? It says most of my players here started playing not so long ago, so I'd like to know what makes the cube great for players who have been in the game for a long time already. For me, the ones that I like the most are just the deepest, most complex ones, right? Like the vintage and legacy cubes. I like powered. I like all of it. I've also played plenty of pauper, or what's the other, peasant, I think they call it. Some of them with some uncommons and some of them just commons. And I love those too, though they end up being a little bit more one note. It's kind of all about the 2-for-1s in those for me. But I basically want to go as deep as possible. As far as cubes that I didn't like, the only one that really stands out, did they call it the legendary cube?
That's exactly what I was going to say. The legendary cube I thought was...
That thing was bad.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty bad. Like, I think that the color shifted cube was weird and I didn't really get into it. The winner of the you make the cube thing. But the legendary cube I thought was just bad. And in general, yeah, I like vintage, legacy, modern cubes. One of the most unique cubes I ever played was Mono Green Cube. That was fun.
Was it sweet?
It was. I don't think it would be sweet the third time, but I played it twice and it was fun. So,
have you ever played the One Drop Cube?
No, that sounds kind of interesting. Is it good?
Yeah, I've heard of that. I don't know. I've never played it either. I always wondered if it would be interesting. And I know one of the kind of cool cubes out there is Eric Klug. He's the best Magic altarist. Yeah, exactly. He takes all anytime a deck wins the Pro Tour, the cards from that deck get added to the cube. And he says it's great. Like, it took a little while to fill in some holes, but he says it's really great now. Like, legit, just a super fun cube to draft. Mitch says, hey guys, love the show. Since Legacy Cube is currently going on Magic Online, I was wondering what your favorite archetypes are. I've played a lot more Vintage Cube than Legacy or Modern Cube, and I'm not as knowledgeable, so I figured to ask the best. Thanks. Mitch, I tend to like the ramp decks when possible. I find those to be pretty busted. Mana Elf does a pretty good impression of a Mox. In a pinch. I also gravitate towards blue-black, generally speaking, though I haven't figured out how good that is in this cube. And blue-white is another deck that I don't normally draft, but that the Legacy Cube I do.
I think that my overall favorite archetype, and actually it translates both into Legacy and Vintage Cube, also Modern Cube, is blue-red. And the reason I like blue-red so much is, first of all, you have the Kiki Jiki Splinter Twin combo. And second, even when you don't get there on the combo, it just has the combination of counter spells, burn spells, and good card advantage, plus threats, especially ones with flash like Vendilion Click, is just really good. And I find these decks to be quite excellent. I think blue-red is the overall best archetype. Volcanic is the overall best dual. Scalding Tarn is the best fetch, etc.
Gotcha. Brian says, hi, Marshall and Luis. I love the show. I'm wondering what you think the correct play is when choosing between making a decision that could go very well or very badly versus making a decision that will be somewhere in between. Do you play it safe or try to spike, or do you choose whichever one has higher average estimated win percentage? Also, do you take more risks when your opponent is a better player than you, although that happens to you less than most of us? I'm sure he's talking to you, Luis, as well as in an unfavorable matchup, for example, in game 2 or 3. Cool question. Yeah. Got a little bit complicated in the middle there, but how do you break that down?
In general, I think that you should take the play with the best overall value. I mean, yes, the boring answer is like try to figure out what the better play is. But I think that the more relevant part of like, when do you take risks versus not? And yeah, I do agree, with Brian saying, like, if a matchup is bad, whether you think that's the matchup with the cards or the matchup with the player, that should make you more inclined to take risks. And I think that's a real thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And by the way, you did kind of nail it, Brian, in the middle part. You said, or do you choose whichever one has a higher average estimated win percentage? And the answer is, of course. That's exactly what you're trying to do at all times, is figure out what has the higher average estimated win percent. We just call that the EV, the highest EV. And sometimes that does come in the form of very risky plays, right? In plays that you very well may lose the game if it doesn't work out. But if that is the play that if you've, logicked it out or ran the numbers that you can run maybe outside of the, off the table, and you figure out that gives you the best chance to win, that's the play you should make. Make that play. Oh, yeah. Even if it feels risky and when you lose, you feel stupid. That's the whole point of all of this, is to figure out those plays over and over and over again. And honestly, kind of ignore that variance aspect, the part where it might look silly if you lose, but you will win more often than if you take that middle ground play. You should do it. That's what we're trying to get to here.
If we can get anyone to make a play that they're uncomfortable with, but is the right play, lose, then make the play again, we have succeeded.
Yes, that's great. Yes. And understood that they knew that was the right thing to do. Danny says, hey guys, I've been listening to the show for a few months now, and I absolutely can't get enough. I feel like every week I take away something new that allows me to level up my game. Thanks, Danny. That is what we're going for here. He says, at last week's FNM, I played in my first 10-man draft pod. I was wondering if you had any tips or things to keep in mind when playing in a 6-person pod or a 10-person pod that might be different from your usual 8.
Very little is different. Legion Conquistador gets better at 10 and worse at 6. I'll tell you that much.
That's right. There's just fewer of them around, right?
The smaller the draft pod, the less the really focused decks are good, because you're just less likely to open the specific cards, especially cards other people wouldn't have taken from you. But in general, you don't have to it's not relearning the game. It is basically the same thing.
Yeah, I think people tend to overemphasize that a little bit. Like, I wouldn't change the way I drafted based on 6, 8, or 10. Trini says, hey, 2 questions. How do you recommend fighting fatigue during tournaments like GPs or midnight pre-releases or long FNM nights? Also, my FNM does draft once a month and sealed only at pre-release events. Suggestions for getting practice for limited GPs. Second question first, Magic Online, or go ahead.
Or do practice sealed with your friend, because it's not something you can build a sealed at your house and then 3 days later play against your friend. It's not like a draft. You need to get everyone there at the same time.
Right. And then the first question is, how do you fight fatigue? I mean, the first thing that you have to do, and I know this sounds obvious, but you have to get enough sleep, and it's so easy not to, because you're excited or nervous for the GP, or, because you stayed up a little too late, then you got up and went to work, then you went straight to FNM and it's dragging on a little bit long. If you don't act like an adult the night before and say, I have to be in bed, I have to do the things I need to do, then you are almost guaranteed to be fatigued no matter what. So take care of that up front, so that when you walk in, you at least have the best chance to do it. And then the thing that I need to do sometimes is just take a minute of quiet in between rounds, or whatever, to just sort of reset my brain. Some people are the opposite. Some people like to keep playing other games or just little mindless games in between, just to sort of keep themselves fresh. But I like to kind of disconnect for just a minute, not even very long, literally just a few minutes, 4 or 5 minutes. And that helps me out when I'm doing coverage and stuff.
I think that the other thing is, if you're going to play a midnight pre-release, you're going to be tired. I don't think there's any way around that, and I would not. I would not recommend even trying to fight it. Like, look, you know what you signed up for.
Yeah, that's why I don't play those anymore. I just don't enjoy them.
I can't. I'm not cut out for those, I'm afraid.
No, and I am. I stay up super late, but even then, I'm like, nah, this isn't worth it. Theodore says, hey, you two awesome guys. I have a question about drafting. If you've already answered this question comprehensively in a recent episode, please point me to that one. I'm having trouble with telling whether a color is open. I draft with my friend on Magic Online. Sometimes it's third pick, and he's like, blue doesn't look very open. Can you really tell that quickly? Is there any way to not get deceived by packs with abnormal amounts of a single color? How early should I be looking for signals? So Theodore, the way that I write about this and talk about this is I consider each pack a data point. And it is rare that one data point is enough to sway me fully in a different direction from the one that I'm on. But when I start seeing multiple data points, then I'm building a case for this color being open, right? You see a third pick water knot, and you're like, okay, the person on my right probably, or the person passing me, probably not in blue, but they might be, or it could just have been a stacked pack or whatever. Okay, but maybe I'll take it. Maybe I won't. Let's say I decide to pass it. If I see another one, I'm like, okay, that's 2 very strong data points, right? Now I'm starting to really think that blue might be open. The next pack has a Siren Reaver in it. And I'm like, I'm sold. I think the blue's open here. The times when you don't want to do it is you see one card and you just move in for it, and then you don't actually pay attention to the fact that it was kind of a fluke. It is not uncommon at all for a pack to be overloaded with a few cards in the same color. And it's also not uncommon at all for the packs to just have one good card of a given color. And you feel like it may have dried up on you, but it was just the packs and you were actually right the whole time.
I think that the biggest thing to look at is the delta between where a card is and what pack it is. And it's harder to tell when something's not open than open, because when you see a 5th pick, first pick, like you see an Impale 5th pick, then yeah, black's probably open. If you go through a whole pack and see nothing like that, then black's probably not open, but it's a little less clear, right? So,
right.
I think that you can't tell by third pick if blue's not very open. That's just not realistic. But what you can do is like, it's fifth pick and there's no cards that you really that interested in taking so far. Then at that point, you have to get suspicious and think like, why is this, why hasn't this shown up? What am I missing here?
Yeah. Like I would translate your friend's assumption not into this color is clearly not open, but into I'm getting some evidence here that this color's not open. And I think that is, it's a running tally that you keep as you go through. Waylon says, hey, Marshall and Luis, longtime listener. I got back into Magic during triple cons and have spent my entire time playing limited ever since then. As someone who's toying with the idea of taking the plunge into constructed, what format would the skills I've developed in limited best translate? I know Luis is a vintage aficionado and Marshall loves Canadian Highlander, but I'm curious if you guys think that there's a constructed format that best aligns with the core fundamentals developed in limited, and what advice, if any, you'd have for a limited only player looking to try it constructed for the first time.
Hey, Waylon. I think that, I don't think there's a constructed format that really aligns with limited that much. I think that
definitely not vintage.
If there's a Highlander format that has a lot of creatures in it, that's probably the closest because limited decks are basically Highlander. If you really like limited and you're trying to think of what constructed format would be fun, honestly, I would start with standard. It seems kind of weird to say that, but I think that the reason to start with standard is that standard is more about the fundamentals of Magic than modern or legacy or vintage are. Like games of, the joke is always like, Dredge is playing Magic like Dr. Garfield intended, right? Like,
right.
Modern and legacy and vintage have these games of Magic that bear no relation to how Magic would look if you opened a starter deck and started playing. Standard is a little closer to that. Standard is still like you're playing creatures, you're playing removal spells, you're trying to play to the board, and you're playing a land each turn and tapping it for mana. You're not playing games of people who have no lands in their deck or people who every land in their deck taps for 2 mana and they're trying to play spells that make all spells more expensive and so no one can ever do anything. So I think that standard is a good jumping in point. The only caveat I would say is if there's a particular modern deck you've seen or heard about that sounds really awesome, maybe try that because modern has some really cool focus decks that like do the same thing over and over again, and that can help you dip your toe in without, really fully having to learn every single thing that's going on. Like if you know how to play your living in deck really well, then you'll do fine, even if you don't know what every single deck is doing. Plus, living in lets you cast 5 mana 4/4s eventually, so it's kind of like limited.
And cards that if you drafted those formats you will be familiar with. All right, we've got a few more questions to go before we wrap this thing up. Sam says, I have a really hard time switching gears between different cubes, legacy being now on so soon after vintage has inspired this. He says, and I was wondering if either of you had some insight on how to get in the right frame of mind for the different cube. It's much easier to adjust between drafting regular sets and a cube. That is interesting. I mean, I try to just gear the complexity down for the legacy cube. Legacy cube to me feels like, regular draft just completely amped up, where vintage cube doesn't feel like that at all.
I mean, the biggest difference is mana. Legacy and modern cube are pretty close together. In fact, I think that the decks are going to look very similar. The difference in vintage and those other two is just like there's fast mana in vintage. There's Moxes and Lotus and Soul Ring and Time Walk and all these other like ways to accelerate out broken plays. So in vintage cube, I just assume I'm always going to do broken things and cheat on mana costs. Essentially, in legacy and modern cubes, it's like you're paying mana for your spells. You're doing it the fair way. So just try to draft good cards.
Right. Next question comes from Glenn, who says, hey, Marshall and Luis, love the show. Almost every time I draft, I end up with an under average number of rares and uncommons in my pool, such as 2 rares and 5 uncommons. Is this something I should be concerned about? Perhaps I draft commons over uncommons because I'm more familiar with them and end up losing value because of it. What do you guys think?
Wow, it's the first time.
I'm curious where you.
First time I've ever heard someone say they draft too few rares.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I wonder what makes you think that 2 rares and 5 uncommons. Like, I have no idea what the average is.
They're saying compared to the number of packs you have, maybe. Like, you open 3 rares and you open 9 uncommons. So if you have less than that, you're taking less than your fair share. But yeah, I don't think the presumption is that you're supposed to have. But if I have 2 rares in my deck, I usually feel like I'm doing pretty well. So
yeah, I wonder, Glenn, if you, I think the core question here is this something you should be concerned about? I don't know. Do you feel, Glenn, like you're not trying out cards because you're kind of retreating to the safety of the cards that you already know, the commons that you see draft in and draft out? If you are doing that, then that's a problem. You should absolutely be, dipping over into those uncommons. Uncommons are often the most important cards in Limited because they're the ones that you see often enough and that they can print them in sort of a build around type function, but not so powerful, that they have to be at rare. So uncommons are super important. The rares is kind of the luck of the draw, right? You hope to open up an on-color or colorless rare that you'd like to put in your deck. And if you don't, and that's it. Maybe somebody will pass one to you. But the uncommons is kind of the sweet spot, I think, Glenn. And I think you should really look at that. I wonder if Glenn finds himself
basically,
mentally shying away.
Basically, I would be concerned only if you're like, I'm taking this common over this uncommon because I don't know how good this uncommon is. If that's not happening, I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, I wouldn't. My gut says that this isn't a big problem, Glenn. I think you're doing fine. Chris says, hi, guys. Must say I love the show and don't know where I'd be without LSV's insight and Marshall's sweet, smooth, charming voice. And he says, not that you both don't have great insight and nice voices. I'm just going to stop talking now. He says, anyway, my question is for Limited and Constructed. I find myself oftentimes being able to identify what to sideboard in, but sideboarding stuff out is always the more difficult task. I imagine this stands to reason, but I was wondering if you had any pointers or heuristics on sideboarding out. Funny, I often do it the opposite.
Oh,
I often look at the cards. I'm like, well, these are all terrible. What could I replace them with, rather than thinking first about what I'm going to be bringing in?
Most often, it's not actually the last card you added in that you're going to take out. It's mostly like a removal spell that has a few targets, like a 1 damage removal spell, or on the flip side of that, like a 2/1 if your opponent has multiple 1/3s and like a dual shot. So, or other types of cards that I frequently board out is I board out auras against people who I've seen 3 or 4 removal spells from game 1. And yeah, I think that basically situational cards of all types, whether it's auras or, narrow removal or creatures with weird stats, are the kind of things that I look to take out.
Yeah, another easy way to do this is to ask yourself the question in your head, just like put down your sideboard for a second and say, what is my opponent's game plan? And then look at the cards that you're considering taking out and say, is this card good against my opponent's game plan? Like you said, if they have a bunch of 1/4s and 0/4s and 1/3s and you're packing a bunch of 2/1s, you might look at that and say, is this good against my opponent's game plan? And you go, no. And that might be a candidate for a card you want to take out. Last question comes from Adam. He says, in formats like Rivals with large board stalls and big creatures, I find it difficult to know when I should attack and when it's correct to hold back. Are there any basic heuristics I should keep in mind for these situations? Love the show. Keep up the great work. Yeah, there are, Adam. One of the first things that you should realize on a very fundamental level is that Magic is designed in a way that it favors the blockers, the defending player, in some minute ways, like the fact that your attacking player has priority and has to decide what they're going to do before you do. Therefore, you get to respond to their actions like pump spells and the like. But an even much bigger perspective is that double blocking is a thing. There's no such thing as double attacking, or anymore at least. And what that means is that your opponent has simply much more flexibility as the blocking player to put blocks up that are favorable for them and unfavorable for you. So you're already, when you're deciding whether you're going to attack, you need to have a pretty good reason to do it, because in many scenarios, your opponent is already heavily advantaged against you when you're in these situations that you mentioned with the board stalls and the big creatures. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of times when you're not going to want to attack. And then the rest is honestly just kind of busy work, right? It's just going through and imagining in your head how your opponent would most likely block under most scenarios and finding out if that's beneficial for you or not.
Basically, the episode where we try to lay out heuristics for this is our best stab at it, but it's really hard to give you general rules besides what Marshall said of like the combat favors the defender.
Right. I know that's a very vague topic, but I mean, that is going to be a factor in every decision you make. when you're deciding to enter combat. All right, great stuff. Thank you so much to everybody who submitted questions. If yours didn't quite make it under the wire, I took all the questions. We actually answered all of them at the time of publishing, but I know that sometimes a few of them will go up after. Yeah, it was a lot of them, and we will certainly thank you for submitting them, and hopefully you'll get it in on the next one. I'll also be refreshing the question of the week thread. So if you have some question from here that didn't quite make it and you'd still like it answered, you can put it in there and it'll be up for contention for that. ChannelFireball.com is the sponsor of this podcast. We encourage you to check them out for all your needs Magic related, including selling your cards back to Channel Fireball. You can do this very easily. You go on their website, you fill it out, you send in the cards, and boom, they're going to send you money. Or if you'd like to do it for store credit, you're going to get a 30% bonus that you can use for anything at Channel Fireball. So if you're looking to get a box, maybe some singles, anything like that, this is a great way to turn that pile of random rares that you have sitting on your desk into something much more useful for you. If you want to find us on social media, I am Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Marshall, do you believe?
Sure, I believe.
Because one of the great modern mysteries of our time is there a bug with Ponder on Magic Online?
Oh, yeah. I think there is.
Yeah, so you're a shuffler truther.
No, I'm not. I'm not like in any way in any of those things, but this one bug thing I do think
so basically for those who aren't aware of the
I'm not a shuffler
supposed
truther.
Bug is that if you cast Ponder, which lets you, put 3 cards back in any order, then hit shuffle and draw a card, you disproportionately draw the last card you put back, even though you hit shuffle. And Marshall does believe it. Like enough people actually believe. I'm not even sure where I land. I feel like it has happened a lot, but on the other hand, confirmation bias is such a pernicious thing.
It's so strong when you're dealing with a bunch of 4-ofs and stuff.
So confirmation bias is something that we touch on from here and there as well, which is basically your mind works that every time you decide to put, an island back on top with Ponder and then shuffle and then you draw an island, you say like, look, it's bugged. Whereas every time it doesn't happen that way, you just ignore. So you draw a lot of false positives, and this happens all the time. It's like, when we get a question like, I'm always 2-0 when I lose, you don't remember the times when you're 2-0 and you win, or you go 2-1 by going 0-1 and then winning your last 2. You just always remember the specific circumstance. And I think it really, where the line really gets drawn in the sand is, do you believe there's a Ponder bug? And I've seen claims of, the Ponder bug being the info wars of our time. There's people with tinfoil hats like,
oh boy.
Like,
yeah.
And, I think I want to believe. I think I want to believe there's a bug, but I don't know if I can. And
we need an answer from you. I answered it.
Right.
I'm a truther.
I believe there's not a bug. I have gone back and forth, but I do believe there is not a bug because I think that confirmation bias is that dangerous. But I feel like the lines are drawn here, and there's a lot of people on each side. So I'm curious whether you do believe. I'm curious whether the listeners who play Magic Online believe, because this is a great unanswered mystery because there's just no way to ever answer it. Basically, we're never going to get the data. And
God, I hope it shows up on a bug report.
Here's the problem: is I work on digital card games, and we had a card that shuffled 3 really good cards into your deck. Right? It was like a 1-mana 2/1, and it shuffled. This is in Elder Scrolls Legends. It shuffled 3 1-mana 3/3 draw cards with lethal, which is whenever it deals damage, destroy the opposing creature. Okay. And that card was, and we kept thinking like, wow, you draw these cards too often. Like it's Brotherhood Assassin is the name of the created card. You draw too many Brotherhood Assassins. Look, I played 2 on turn 2 and all this stuff. So we had QA check, and they're like, it's not bugged. Like we did a bunch of regressions. It's fine. The problem was once there was a card like that was bugged. So we'd never in the history believed it was, whatever. There's always the seed of doubt. And so once that happened it's like it ruins us, because then we just get confirmation bias all over the place.
Oh yeah.
So
all right. Well, let us know. I'm curious what
if you get anything from this, by the way, it's that confirmation bias is a very difficult thing to defeat.